Today, I am really excited to have Ryan Daniels on the podcast. Ryan is in charge of growth and partnerships at A.Team, a members only network of the world's top professionals that is designed to connect them with growing companies to help accelerate their product development. Prior to A.Team, Ryan studied at UPenn, getting a degree in philosophy and economics, and later got a Juris Doctorate at Stanford Law School. He also briefly worked as a columnist at the Daily Pennsylvanian, as well as chief of staff at HireScore, which is the leading provider of talent orchestration technology. It was really great having Ryan on the podcast because you get to see how people from diverse backgrounds made their way into the world of software, as well as get some insight into how a growing startup works with different firms and other businesses in order to establish new partnerships to help grow the business. And especially in this decade, as we touched on the podcast, partnerships are so essential for the success of any growing startup today. I really enjoyed having Ryan on the podcast, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. Hello, Ryan, and welcome to the podcast.
Nice to be here, Daivik.
Yeah, super excited to have you on, and let's get started. So, to start off, you have more of a non-traditional background, I think, in software. So I was just wondering, what brought you to the world of software?
The short answer is it's just technology always fascinated me, and I was one of these kids that watched every Steve Jobs presentation when I was in middle school and just was on the edge of my seat for every little development. And when I was in college, I was studying philosophy and economics and really wanted to go into government. And I had this interesting encounter on an academic fellowship with the startup ecosystem of Tel Aviv. And it really changed my life. I just saw the speed of change and innovation. And I realized my fascination with tinkering and hardware and technology didn't just have to be sort of an interest. It could be something that I worked on. And once I got into the startup world, there was no turning back. I couldn't get, nothing moved quite as fast, and just had the breadth of imagination as a startup world. You could just, dream as big as you wanted, and nobody would tell you to slow down. They'd tell you to speed up.
Right. Yeah, for sure. No, I think especially in the last couple of years, before I think 20, 30 years ago, there's a lot of people from different backgrounds, but even then I think it was very engineering dominated. But I think what we've seen in the last 10 years, that a lot of people from non-traditional tech backgrounds have been able to really break in and make it their own. And I think we're seeing some of the best ideas in the world come from people who don't have engineering degrees or who aren't coming from that background. And I think that's a big reason why. Because
really, and I'll make an even bigger plug, which I think is even more rare for people from legal backgrounds. Which, honestly, it's they're still very rare in tech and software, but I think do come with a pretty rigorous framework for how to approach difficult ideas in places of extreme uncertainty. And so there's something to be said for that. I don't think it's going to become mainstream at any point soon, but right. I do think that some legal minds get a little overlooked.
Except for mergers and ACK, it's big tech because those guys work overtime.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, diving into, so, you got into the role of software. You mentioned that you decided to join that startup incubator. And so, that was sort of your first taste and you really loved it. So I was just wondering, from there, now you're working in growth and partnerships. So specifically focusing on that, what made you interested in growth and partnerships?
Yeah, so it's funny. So when I came back to join A.Team, my current company, I had this theory. We were, I think, fewer than 20 people when I came back, and I had this theory from my first startup that I'll do better without a title, and that's not the most obvious choice, I think, in a lot of ways. But when a company is that small, and my background is I've worked on a handful of things at startups in the past. It was a way to sort of feel what made the most sense, and also, more importantly, where could I add real value to the company? And so there was I would say several months of finding the right fit and trying a bunch of things and doing multiple things at once, which I still do. This partnership world is fascinating because in some ways it's just, a sort of cousin of just the traditional business development, right? You're just sort of finding ways to expand growth of the company, but there's this level of creativity that's different. When you do traditional sales, you understand your value proposition of what you're selling in your core product, and then you find people that will benefit from that. In partnerships, it's right. It sounds obvious, but there's a third party that's going to benefit for it, and then you find this partner who has some strange unintended um, benefit from working with you, where they're not even consuming or using your product. They're maybe finding people that might use your product, or you're finding people that might use their product, or some strange, completely novel things come up. And so then the last component is even more exciting is this idea that a rising tide lifts all boats. And when you create a lot of partnerships across different types of entities, whether that's like investors or companies or individuals, you create something of an ecosystem where everybody stands to benefit by just working and communicating with each other. And the fact that that's a job that I can actually do all day is amazing. Like, all I do is find interesting companies and people and entities, and figure out really creative and non-obvious ways to work together and you can just find out towards after just developing ideas how it actually benefits the growth of our company, and it almost always does, right? Like, that's
Right.
the coolest part.
Right. Yeah, and I think especially what we've seen in the last decade or last couple of years is that integration between companies and partnerships between companies have really it's an open culture now for that.
Right. Yeah.
And we've seen some great new innovation happen from these partnerships, whether it be in AI and all the partnerships all the companies have together, or in the startup world as well, where with all these API integrations, people are able to build platforms
Right.
for a lot of different individuals, and that's something that wasn't possible before because everybody used to sort of safeguard it, but especially with open source and just more collaboration in general. I think partnerships have really changed the game.
It's totally right. And I think, it's fascinating to see companies that are emerging and all they do is help different companies partner with each other. Like, the fact that that exists tells you exactly what you said, everything about ecosystem. And I think there's a line of thinking in the sort of like employment world that in California, the reason why California is such a productive landscape for tech companies is because non-competes are unenforceable. So you can't prevent one of Google can't prevent its top AI engineer from going to Facebook and being an AI
Right.
engineer there. And so there's this interesting thing where reducing the constraints on competition actually benefits the whole ecosystem. And it's cool to see that a lot of tech companies today, as we become more and more specialized, are appreciating that and wanting to actually collaborate more with each other rather than be more siloed.
Right.
Right. It's super cool.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's a difference. Like, it's making a difference in the whole culture. Like, even one of the most siloed companies in the world, like even Apple is releasing open source frameworks now,
Right. Right.
which is I don't think many people could have thought of that a decade ago, even, right? So
Totally.
it's
Totally.
it's changing the culture completely. But yeah, so let's get into A-Team. And so
Right.
you sort of mentioned this, that you came back to A-Team. So
Mhm.
I wanted to touch on that a little bit. So prior to A-Team, you were an advisor for them. So I wanted to first dig into how did you land that? Like, how did you end up meeting A-Team as an advisor,
Well,
and then what ended up with you switching to them full time?
I wish there were better stories. It's just right place, right time. I'd known the two founders, actually Raphael, one of the founders, I'd known him for almost a decade. And so I lived in Tel Aviv for a few years working my first startup, and he was, a big figure in the community there. And honestly, the moment I met him, had thought one day I'd love to work with this guy if I'm so lucky. And I just, I happened to be in New York when I was living in the Bay Area, visiting New York, and like a month after the idea of A-Team first came about, and he was talking with two other co-founders about it, and just over coffee, like big picture ideas. The concept was all just we don't do something with teams. We have no idea what that even looks like. It was so blue sky. And I just happened to be there in the room and kind of was overhearing and was like, let's talk more about this. And so Raphael we started brainstorming a little bit. And over the ensuing months, we're talking just every few weeks about just different ideas and kicking things around and seeing our sort of the synergies in the way that we thought and how we complemented each other. And he thought really big picture. Kobi, another co-founder, thought really sort of concrete about how we can actually bring those big picture ideas into practice. And getting to bounce between their two ways of thinking was like just electrifying. And so I was in grad school. So when I finally finished grad school and I had a little time on my hands before I started a full-time job, I said, well, I got to do something with you guys. I don't know what it looks like, but
Right.
I got to work with you guys. And so started taking on a few projects and advising on a very early referral program. I think that's what we were doing. This was the summer of 2020.
I see.
And it just went from there. And at that point, it was truly a way for me to assess, like, is it really as good as it looks from the outside, right? And
Right.
it was once I got on the inside, it was just, there were like 5 or 6 of us back then, and it was just um, so much excitement for what the future plans would be, and so much dedication from the team. So
Right.
that's where it all started.
Yeah, no, that I think especially with an early stage startup, I feel like I've heard a lot of those types of stories where a lot of people were really bought into the founder. Of course, the idea is really important too, but I think the founders especially, they're passionate with the idea and the energy they bring into the room, sort of
Yeah.
unexplainable, but that leads so many people to join them. So
And you've
right place, right
identified
time, like you mentioned.
yeah, like it's funny you've identified that. It took me years to figure out what that feeling was, but this happened. I've had this a handful of times where you meet a founder and you can sit with them for 3 hours and it feels like 30 minutes, and you're literally shaking because you're so excited. And at first I thought, is the coffee different when I go to these coffee shops with these founders? Like, what is this that's changing? And it's just they have this infectious excitement about what they're doing and the
Right.
possibilities about what they might be able to do, and it's contagious. I mean, it really is.
Right. And I think for founders, especially keeping that energy and that contagious energy, and especially if they see in somebody else, it makes a lot of sense to bring them on board and keep that excitement going.
Right.
Because
Totally.
I think when the times get really tough, and with a startup, a lot of times can get very tough, that energy is what you have to really fall back onto to keep you going. So,
Yeah, there was this great podcast with Raul, the founder of Superhuman, the email app, and he basically said, like, there's a theory that the founder of a company just runs into a wall over and over and over again, so that the rest of the team doesn't have to, and they can just do their work. And it's not like the wall ever really breaks; they just push it slightly, bit by bit, and that's just like the job title. And yeah, so there's an element of just being like having to just be the most optimistic person to
right,
push the rest of the company along. And I do think, like, you know you can find people and bring them in who have that same excitement and who have the same sort of like inspiring drive. And it's like there are many people in the team now who have built sort of their own domains, and built their own teams, and they play that same role for their teams, and then in a different way for the company, of just pushing, pushing, pushing against
right.
all odds.
Right. Makes sense. Well, talking about right place, right time, you mentioned that it was summer 2020 when you really got to know about A-Team. And I think, especially with COVID, there were a lot of people have gone remote. And a byproduct of that is that it's enabled so many more people to take their career into their own hands and have more flexibility of the work that they get to choose. And it's exactly where A-Team sort of slots in. So I was just wondering, when it comes to this growing sect of freelancers, how does A-Team tap into that? And when you think about growth, how do you make sure that you reach out to those individuals?
Yeah, it's obvious, the obvious question. I think first of all, we from an early stage decided not to use the word freelancer, because I think this connotes this more commoditized type of work where you're just like on a marketplace and people can scroll through you like you're on Amazon. And we think of the people on our network as builders. They're people who want to build great products. And it's funny, like at one point we were dogmatic about the nomenclature, but I think words matter. And I wouldn't want to work as a freelancer personally. Like it's nothing that attracted me, but I see the projects on our network, and being a builder is it. It makes sense. You want to contribute to these teams. I think the first. I remember really really well in March, April 2020, speaking with Raphael, and kind of they had their first couple of teams launched, and we were talking about, well, what do we do now with COVID? And um, they had this idea. We had this idea to have COVID teams. Like, you kind of would go on the A.Team website. We built this scrappy landing page, and it would just check a box that said, like, we're going to have a team that is specific to that needs COVID help. And all of a sudden we were deploying tons of teams that were doing, like, working on the most ambitious projects for COVID relief efforts, for vaccine distribution, for providing relief to people who were out of work, etc. And so that made sense. But on the builder side, you obviously get the most talented, passionate people who wanted to join these efforts, and everybody wanted to help. You remember that phase where, like, if you weren't an emergency responder or like a frontline worker, you were like kind of stuck at home. And if you were
Right.
involved in software, everybody was just like, how can we find ways to help? And so A-Team played this little role. And we also saw, of course, at that time, like, this is where work is going. Like, we need to, like, the COVID relief efforts were great, but we also saw, like, it's this insane wave in our wind in our sails, that, like, this is the way that all these great product builders who work at great technology companies, we're talking about people 8-10 years of experience at, like, all the FANG companies, who are startup veterans. Like, they wanted to work on these ad hoc teams with great people on ideas that spoke to them and mattered to them and pushed the needle. And so COVID was like just the beginning of that, but that's when
Right.
everything took off. And so on the growth side, like, um, it just was so organic. We were in stealth as a company until May of this year, so 6 months ago. And so that's 2.5 years of the company's lifespan. We didn't have anything about us on the internet, and we did no marketing, and we did no ads. And the network grew to 6,000 people, of just people bringing
Wow.
their friends in, right? And like their ex coworkers, and like talking about, hey, have you heard of this A-Team thing? We can work in a team together. And that was extraordinary. And, um, that was on the builder side, like, there was no greater validation that we were onto something than seeing the
Right.
way, right? Like, you're not even trying to sell them on something. You're like, this is just something you should try to for your own work experience.
Right. Yeah, and I think especially that network effect that you can see, I think that's a great way of seeing product market fit.
Yeah.
And for you, like, if you haven't advertised at all and you're growing to that number already, 6,000 people, that's a lot. Like, especially being in stealth. So I'm sure that was great in terms of really really seeing that you guys are in the right direction.
Look, there's these communities of anybody sort of involved in the software world online, as you know, right? And so people, whether it's Reddit or more niche places, like, people are talking. And our mentality at A-Team of being so builder first, like, that's just when we have difficult conversations, which every startup is familiar with, and we're going to the core of, like, how do we decide between quality and quantity, or whatever, like, we go back to that question of, well, like, what's builder first, right? Like, what
Right.
what would, if I was a builder on this network, what would I look at and say, okay, A-Team has my best interest in mind? And these are things that seem pretty out of touch. They're so niche and nuanced, and things that you'd never thought would actually be recognized on our platform, and yet they are. Like, that sentiment is felt by the builders, and so there was something there that it grew in itself.
Right. So if you don't mind me asking, then, like, I think especially like when you're stealth for a while, there's always this point, like, when we go out of stealth
Mhm.
and become a public facing company. And so I was just wondering, can you give us a little bit of insight into the decision making process there? Like, why did you guys decide to move out of stealth and become public?
So, we have this weird thing, maybe not that weird, but we wanted to, like, always feel in control of our destiny, and it's something we talk about a lot. We raised our Series A, which was a 55 million Series A. So that's the kind of thing that grabs headlines in
Right.
December of last year. So about a year ago. And we didn't do anything. Like, we didn't announce it. We didn't talk to anybody. You have to file certain forms with the SEC, a Form D, to disclose these rounds. And we tried to hide them as much as we could. We didn't even file it until May, actually. And so we just waited until we felt like we'd really finished fleshing out the first version of what this A-Team ecosystem could be, right? Which was the layer of launching hundreds of teams, having a big network that we saw. It wasn't just like this kind of you know um, transient idea that overlapped with COVID, which you're seeing, I think, across the tech world everywhere. A lot of companies are having to recalibrate from the crazy growth they had during COVID, right? So,
Hmm.
that was a concern. Is this just a temporary phase where people want to hire these on-demand, remote, distributed product teams? But once we return to the office, that won't happen. So we wanted to wait and really know that we tapped into something here that wasn't going to change back. So that was part of it. I think the other thing was just seeing the sort of consistent recurring growth of the network was meaningful. And then the third part was, which was most important, we'd been kicking around this idea for the longest time of how can we create the first builder-owned network? So if you think about like Uber and Lyft being marketplace 1.0, where you have like one entity that owns the platform, and then you have the supply and demand sides of the platform, but all the real value of that network is owned by that entity that builds the platform, right? Uber's
Right.
stock is worth a lot. The drivers they don't benefit at all from the stock price of Uber. And and there's platforms like Juno that have tried to distribute equity to their drivers, but it turns out it's pretty hard to do when you have so many who don't work in sort of reliable ways, and frankly, for whom company equity can be a confusing concept. That's not an
Right.
issue for us. We're working with veteran, product builders and software experts, and who all know what equity entails. So we came up with this concept of distributing the upside of the A-Team network, which is a bit more sophisticated, and it's certainly a rabbit hole that I can go to legalistically, but of distributing that upside with the builders in our network. And we wanted to wait until that was fleshed out enough that it might not be like live and attainable, but like at least we had a plan for actually starting to share this upside with our builders. And that's that moment when we thought, okay, this is right. That's when we went live to the public. What was
Right.
fascinating is we announced our Series A to our builders community in January, like 3 weeks after the Series A, as just like, hey guys, you're the first that need to know. And then we were waiting for the leaks and waiting for whatever, and it never came. So it was cool to see that, putting the community first, which is, I remember Raphael saying at the time, like, how do we keep involving the community and the builders? Like, how are we builder first? Um, yeah, it just made us feel like this was the right way to do it. And then,
Right. Yeah, no, I think like it's really fascinating right now. I think with a lot of big startups to realize that the community aspect is so important and so central.
yeah,
And like I've seen so many startups actually like even they'll be seed round or Series A and they'll start making their Discord channels and have that direct line of communication with their with their users and customers. So it's really cool seeing how you guys have put the builders in the center and you really have that community aspect nailed down there.
yeah, it's, like, and it's not like they're sort of sporadic users of a B2C product. I mean, they're working, some of them, over 100 hours a month through A-Team, more, and their claws are deep in this thing, and so it's neat to get, and now it's going much farther. Like now we have a clubhouse that we opened in New York, where builders come in a few days a week and get to collaborate together, or if they're not even working together on the same teams, they just all get to be together. And then we started doing, after we came out of Stealth in May, launch parties in different cities around the world where we identified that we had sort of larger communities. So we did one like in Lisbon, I think one in London, Toronto, Chicago, sort of cities where, we just looked at the data and saw where we have a lot of builders that were live on missions. And it was really like surreal to understand that we built this online community and it wasn't like a fake, ethereal thing. It was real people who were craving this sort of connection to something bigger than themselves and showed up in big numbers it's just and loved it and like wanted it and like loved this A-Team concept. It's not just a website, right? It's a real thing.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I think especially like when you I've seen this too, like when I meet up with people who I've met only
Right.
online,
Yeah.
I meet them in person, it sort of blows my mind because it really contextualizes everything. That hey, they were behind their computer and they were talking like of course that's obvious, but like when you go and meet in person, it's a whole different flavor to your interactions. So that must have been a crazy moment for you guys.
There should really be like a word for it, honestly. Like this post-COVID phenomenon of like even spending hundreds of hours talking to some person that you've never met and then
Right.
realizing how
Yeah.
tall they are.
Yeah, for sure. But talking a little bit the product itself, I think one of the interesting parts there is that a lot of companies put a lot of emphasis on hiring and especially getting people with the right culture.
Mhm.
There's a lot of theories on how to make people work together and mesh together and play to each other's strengths.
Yeah.
But given the nature of A-Team, given that it's like remote teams that then come together, how do you help companies make sure that they're getting the right builders to come together and that are
Mhm.
meshing to each other's strengths?
Yeah, look, this is the question, right? Like this is the fundamental question that is at the core of what we think we're doing differently or in a somewhat unique way is how do you build in a scalable way teams? And this was like the question that A-Team set out to answer was, can we like productize teams? And can we, create on-demand teams the way like teams were this, this analogy that I think an investor of ours came up with early on was, um, you think about like servers were on premise for the longest time, right? And then, 20 or so years ago, they began to be cloud-based, and companies hated this idea because they thought that for sort of not just security, but sort of like proprietary reasons, they needed servers to be on site. And,
Right.
obviously now, like we know what happened. And so we had this idea, right? Same thing. Our teams are those things that have to be like tangible assets that are essentially on premises, wholly owned, no matter how much you're using the teams, and or are they things that can be sort of cloud based? And that's the question. And so, forming these teams, of course, is an art and a science. And one of our earliest advisors is Adam Grant, who thinks so much about organizational psychology in the most cutting edge ways. And so we're doing tons of experiments with him and other academics on, right, like the sort of science and about systematically and replicably building teams. And then there's a certain component. So there's a certain component there. I think from a technical standpoint, for now, it's about just what data can we gather. And so as much, we have a decent amount of investment in AI on our platform, but even more fundamental is just like creating taxonomies around skills, and understanding like what those look like and how we can honestly assess what skills different builders have, and then looking at, well, which skills complement each other well, right? Like, what does it mean to be this level of management, and what kinds of people are you qualified to manage, and do you need to have expertise in the same languages to be able to manage this person, or is it actually complementary to not? Like, we can just see this, right, from the data that we collect from each team that launches. And these are questions that, frankly, we don't know the answers to yet. Like, we're still learning. I think, I can go on. This is truly like, this is the crux of the A-Team product right now. I think, one thing that our tech team has been investing in recently is the capability to allow for sort of networking outside of being live on a mission with someone, right? So like right now it's, there's a sort of this effective marketplace function, right? Like you come into A-Team, you look for, some sort of mission or project, we call them missions, and then you get on them and then you start working. But what if you were to like have other features where you got on and you just like found people that you could click, I want to work with him and I want to work with them. And we could just sort of start to figure out, well, why is that your revealed preference? Like why him? What is it about them? And so that's also interesting, right? Like then we have to understand what do you see in this person's skill sets or background or work experience that it makes them so attractive to you to want to work with, and then is it also meaningful? Like, do you actually want to work together? So those are all interesting things. And then I guess the last thing I'll point to is there's the sort of team formation process, which we obviously specialize in, and then there's the team. It's actually, I have this book in front of me. This is a book called Teaming. That's a pretty like sort of well-known book, also organizational psychology, that talks about like teaming is a verb, and it's something that isn't just like the act of forming a team, but is something that you continue to do as a team together, once you're launched and once you're starting to work together. And there's ways that you can improve on that process. And we're not even scratching the surface on that, right? And so like that's the team sort of management aspect.
Right. Yeah, it's a really tough problem. And I mean, if you can crack it, I think sky is really the limit. And it's, I think you have great minds at A-Team as well to help you guys crack this problem.
Yeah.
But, there's so many different factors that you have to think about. So, yeah, it makes sense. But I think, I guess after the initially forming the team, though, you'll start seeing bonds like be created with the team, or people leaving the team, and they'll naturally also form like that, right?
Right. And then this is right. And this is actually another sort of main reason why we wanted to wait so much time before committing to stealth, was also building those bonds between different members of the network who'd been on teams together before, and then going and a company says, hey, we want to build this. We say, oh, you know what? This team built something really similar 6 months ago. Use this team. And like having both the knowledge that and the learning sort of from like an AI standpoint or from a data collection standpoint that we were able to build on and offer a better service. And then also having like that sense of a network that like, this happens every day in any tech company, right? That's like large enough, let's say over 1,000 people, that you have these ad hoc teams that could be working something for 5 hours together or like 6 months or whatever it is.
Right.
And it's just like, it takes them on average 3 to 6 months to hire the right person. And then it takes them probably another 90 days, 3 months to onboard them. And so there's a lot of just overhead there that companies face all the time assembling teams. And so really what I'm thinking was, well, we already know that we can do this. We've done this at companies. So why can't we do this as a service? And so we're already doing this. I mean, there's no doubt we've seen time and time again, teams that worked really well a year ago, we put some, similar form of that team together. Maybe it's like the same 3 core members and they bring on a few different developers, but
Right.
Some permutation of it, they work really well again. And we know that because we're assembling and collecting data constantly from clients and from builders on who they've worked with and how they like working with them, every 2 weeks, taking the pulse of the team. So it's totally doable. And it's just when you rely on small companies or even large companies to do it, you don't always get it right. And so it's something that we, already know that we can sort of just add value with.
Right. And I think, now that I'm starting to think about it, it can become really fascinating because you mentioned you could have 3 core team members who work really well together,
Right.
and they might have their own subculture. And, when more people come in, they'll form their subculture. And then you could have, I think a lot of people, when they think about culture, always think about from the company's point of view, which is true.
Yeah.
But if you actually look at it, it's so team dependent, especially at big tech.
Totally.
Your role can completely change depending on what team you're on. And so it's really fascinating to think about it from that perspective, that you can have these sub teams of different cultures that work really well together and can solve
Right.
problems.
And look, it's the fundamental question that obviously everybody's asking in HR right now about this new hybrid workforce that I think is here to stay. And that's not that's a very banal statement at this point. We just have seen what happened. Right. Is how are these teams going to work? And, we had an interesting, we brought in this speaker to an event recently who's a labor economist at the Federal Reserve and has done a lot of empirical research on sort of remote versus in-person teams. And productivity actually goes up for remote teams on the whole, sort of controlling for different variables. But the opportunity to learn and upskill tends to go down. So this is this weird crux. It's not necessarily a problem with remote teams. It's just a challenge that we have to figure out how to overcome, which we're thinking a lot about. But certainly strategically forming your teams with slightly more junior member and a more senior member, this is the key to not just upskilling, but also building those cultural norms within teams, right? And when you have replicable teams, and something we just launched last week at Web Summit is what we call the CXO network, where we have a small group of let's say 30 very seasoned veterans or product builders who've been in C-suite roles in startups or even large Fortune 500 companies who work with us in different ways. And they come in and they sort of spec out problems at companies and then they build a team around themselves, right? That's a whole interesting mechanism that people are involved in building their own teams. And we did this because we looked back, again, empirically, sort of looking at the data we have on a few hundred teams and saw some really, really good teams perform this way of a product manager or software architect coming in, specing the problem and bringing his friend and then someone else and then looking through our network and finding someone else. And we augment the process, but it's, like I said, there's an art and a science. And there's a deeply human complex or component to it.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, people product managers who have been there, head of products or solutions architects or whoever, it's part of their role at any company. Hiring is such an essential part. And I feel like if they're going up the ranks at certain companies, you have to have that part of you there where you're able to identify good talent. And I don't think you'll be able to do that without having that part of you there. So it makes sense empowering them independently to use those skill set that they have to form the right teams. Because a lot of times they have insights into what can make the team click and make the team work.
Totally.
Yeah. So, you went into the product. I want to touch a little bit on the partnerships too. So especially we've talked about the builder experience, but I think partnerships with the businesses is really important with A.Team as well, because businesses need to make sure that, they can trust the platform, they can trust the people on there, and there's a certain level of credibility. So when you think about building partnerships with businesses, what is your thought process behind that?
So there's the more business development side that works with different companies and getting them teams, right? And that's anywhere from, let's say, a 10-person startup or maybe even a 5-person startup that's putting together their initial product team to we've put 30-person teams together for large Fortune 500 companies that have extremely ambitious digital transformation agendas, and they can't get the right people at their company, and they go through A.Team. So that's sort of like on that side. And I think everything I've told you in the last, even 15 minutes about like how we do this sort of team curation process and why that's so hard to do at a company where that's just like one function of the company, um, is immediately compelling to most sort of technical or product leaders at large companies or small companies, whatever. I think the partnerships role or aspect is really interesting because the question is more, well, how can we work with more of these companies through like sort of intermediaries? So like, it's fundamentally through, VC funds, investors who hear all day long from their companies because they're on typically they take a board seat. And so they're on, board meetings and they're hearing from their companies, we can't hire fast enough or we can't hire the right people. And even now, like even in our current environment where you see layoffs from large tech companies, there's still a hard time finding the right people for the right roles. There's a lot of competition, and as much as like inflation rates are going up and trying to soften the labor market, it's still very tight. So especially for highly skilled labor and really for some of the best hires. So that's kind of on that end of the spectrum. Working with VC funds, I think they also see there's an increasing push over the last, I'd say, 4 or 5 years after the sort of Andreessen model of VC funds being full service. And you expect your investor not just to give you dollars and disappear, but to be mentors and advisors and make introductions and be strategic. And having a talent capability is one of those just core 5, let's say, functions. And so a lot of VC funds don't have bandwidth to act as a recruiter for all of their portfolio companies. And so A.Team serves as this critical sort of like partner role where they can just send them to us and we can, get them a team very quickly. So we work with a small handful of VC funds, about 2 dozen. We've been very thoughtful about which ones we're going to work with because we're sort of going after their portfolios. But that's been a huge source of, I would say, 50%, and that's a high number of our best missions as rated by the builders come from investors because they are the best people that understand ideas and concepts and founders. We don't have to do that diligence. And they say, we have this great idea. We gave them money. Now they need to hire a team, like put a team together. Let's go, to A.Team. And it comes from there. And they don't, it's not like let's either do an A.Team or hire full time. They'll just hire an A.Team and have them stick around for the first years of the company. And sometimes they convert to full time, but it's not even necessary. It's like back to this cloud versus on premises server analogy. Like this idea that you own an employee is completely illusory and not true. Like they're at will employees; they can leave at any time. And so we're starting to see now that we've been around for a few years, the tenure of an A-teamer is almost as long as the average time an employee stays at a tech company for like let's say Series A, Series B tech company. So that's one, that's VC. The other buckets in the partnerships are private equity funds, which are, obviously sort of like VC, but much bigger, and they have a lot more control and over their portfolio companies because they own like larger stakes and they're more hands-on. I think for those companies, there's a slightly different objective. It's maximizing profitability of some sort of turnaround in usually a 3-year horizon. And how can we do that? There's sort of synergies. There's merging different companies. There's like looking for redundancies. But oftentimes, increasingly, there's how can we take some sort of antiquated industry and improve it with digital innovation? And that's where I don't know about anything that exists that's quite as compelling as having an A-Team hit squad that can come in and build some really transformational tool in an 18-month period and hit the ground running, not from like day 60 or day 90, but from literally day 1, start working and start shipping code. So that's on the private equity side, and I can talk more about that. We have a few partnerships with some pretty large funds there that are understanding the value. And I would say the third and fourth buckets that I can just touch on are, with other software vendors who, that's the third bucket, who have software that needs some sort of implementation or customization or just technical help. And in order for those companies to succeed with their clients, to not be used for some limited use case, but to be used really large in a large way. So like Discord is a company we've worked with a lot, and building on top of Retool, right, which is a no-code, low-code provider, right, and building capabilities that are truly incredible. Like I don't know how much I get into on that, but like truly, I think novel use cases for what can be done on Retool, and that's because of an A-Team being deployed, building on top of it, right? So a few software vendors we're working with to sort of plug in, help them expand their use cases with their clients. Last bucket is creating a partnership or ecosystem of experts, and this relates to that CXO initiative we had before, but working with different, former C-suite executives from large companies to, they're being consulted all day long with or without any involvement with A-Team on, how to help companies with their digital strategies. And nothing makes them look better than saying, I have this great idea that can actually help you implement it like tomorrow.
Right.
A-Team. Like it's not just some hypothetical thing you're going to pay me a bunch of money for. It's like an actionable concept and we can spec it out. And so we've productized that now, but that was something that we've seen a lot. And so we have this really interesting group of people that we partner with. Again, it helps us because we get interesting missions, but it helps them because they can actually, execute on some vision that they've had.
Right. Yeah, and I think now I'm thinking about it, just it's great. Like it's great for growth at A-Team to have this diversity of different businesses that you guys are addressing with partnerships.
Yeah.
But also, it's amazing for the builders as well that are part of A-Team because they have a diversity of problems that they can also tap
Yeah.
into. So, like you mentioned, you might have big partnerships with companies like Discord, and you might also have partnerships with small startups that are just starting off, but have funding from certain VC funds. So, just having that diversity of problems that they can address, I think that brings a lot of value to a lot of builders as well, so they can sort of choose what they want to work on.
Yeah. I think again, builder first, like what do people care about in their work product or like in their work life? And, there's like this book called Drive that I read over the summer that essentially it's, what's his name? Pink, whatever, it doesn't matter. It's like, there's basically three sort of fundamental things that you're looking for with work. There's autonomy, there's purpose, and then there's growth or challenge. And sort of that, so autonomy is, you feel like you own your work and you're not just sort of being bossed around and you have some say. And, purpose is that you feel like you're part of some larger collective and you're not just sort of on your own. And I think this is what people gain a lot from, especially in the US. Like your work is one of your primary social affiliations, right?
Right.
And then challenge is more about upskilling and feeling like you're doing something that's not too hard, but not too easy, but like right on for you. And you're kind of growing in that way. And I think all of these relate to like variety, right? Like everybody says like, I want to do different things every few months or even every few weeks and try different things out. And that's especially in that last bucket of, of this idea of growth. Variety is essential to that. So again, we realized like we can't, and it's actually very hard from a sort of business development standpoint to not be specialized in one specific thing. Like we could have just said like, we are the experts in like crypto or the experts in like health tech AI and just like only had builders do that. But then it's less exciting from the builder standpoint, right? They want the variety. They want, they're really good at X thing and they want to try different projects, and we need to find them that kind of opportunity.
Right. And I mean, that's one of the biggest benefits of being a remote builder, that you
Right.
can have more diversity of opportunity. And that's one of the biggest reasons people love remote as well.
Yeah, that's right. That's totally right.
Well, this has been a great conversation, Ryan. I really enjoyed having you on the podcast. Before I let you go, I got two last questions.
Okay,
The first
great.
one is, you mentioned a couple books throughout this podcast, but I was just wondering if if you could read one book, is there one book you'd recommend us checking out?
I I have a bunch. For anybody in startups, it's such a cliche. The Lean Startup is the best book I've ever read. It's like in the first startup I was working on, I literally carried it around with me, and I had dog-eared pages that I would like come to again and again. There's that, and there's a Steve Blank book called The Four Steps to Epiphany. They're both related, but
Okay.
We take it for granted now, the agile methodology. But it's I think actually people forget just what that really looks like and what it means. So I would say those are just like foundational.
Right. I think I have the Lean Startup in my bookshelf. I haven't gotten around to it yet, but
We'll get to it.
based on this review,
Yeah,
I gotta check it out.
yeah, it's like essential, and I literally bought that book for like a dozen people. So
Oh, okay. Okay, perfect. Well, I'll get started on that pretty soon here, maybe tonight. And yeah, last question is, what are the next steps for you and A-Team? What can we look forward to?
we're continuing to grow. and I would say in a smart way. And look, this is a really exciting year. Like I think, like 2023, I think all the uncertainty with markets and hiring and is to us a very important opportunity to see, can we find builders more certainty by being independent workers and not working full time for one employer, like, which is not the source of the most employment certainty anymore. We're watching rounds and rounds of layoffs happening,
Right.
and so there's something that to me is like actually inspiring about that sort of mandate. Like, can we play some role, however small, in helping builders not just find joy and excitement in their work, but like finding real stability. And so I would say that's a big focus for the coming year, for all of us, and whether it's through partnerships or product or whatever. But yeah, but this has been so much fun. Like, really, thanks for having me on. And I love what you're doing. And the questions were so thoughtful. It wasn't just like a plug and play thing. It was really nice. So thank you.
Oh, no, appreciate it, Ryan. And no, you guys are doing great work at A.Team. And I think especially right now, like you mentioned, there's a lot of big layoffs, especially in the last 2 weeks. About a lot. So, I think it's a really important product that a lot of people can get value out of, and continue the great work at A.Team, guys.
Yeah, we really hope so.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for everyone listening. And thank you so much, Ryan, once again.
Take care.